This episode of the CoinSpice podcast is brought to you by Cash Shuffle, because what you do with your money is your business. To give this new product a try for fungibility and privacy, head on over to electroncash.org, download their latest wallet 4.0.0, and give it a spin. CashShuffle.com for more information, because what you do with your money is your business.
What is really going on, crypto savages? You are listening to the CoinSpice podcast with host C. Edward Kelso, editor-in-chief at coinspice.io, your home for spicy crypto things on the net.
All right, so this is a big thrill for me. I've been a fan for a while, and I have, of course, with me John Popolo, who is part of Emergent Order, which I guess is best described as a creative studio based in Austin, Texas. And they've done some fantastic educational work. And every so often I like to step back away from cryptocurrency proper and kind of get into the fundamentals, the sort of the background, kind of why we do what we do. But before I go too much further, hey, John, thanks so much for coming on, man. I really appreciate it.
It's really great to be on the show. Thanks for having me.
Very cool. So, you came into my orbit as a lot of things do, and I was trying to think back as to exactly how you did, and most things come through Jeffrey Tucker, and I'm not sure how the universe exactly orders that, but something like, could it be 10 years ago? You just sort of burst onto the scene. I know he threw out an email or was in a message somewhere. I was on some sort of chain or whatever, and he linked to this crazy video that was Keynes versus Hayek, Fear the Boom and Bust. And I definitely want to get into the craziness and the madness that sort of ensued after that thing took off and went viral. But how on earth does a guy who has, video production background with MTV, with Spike, and some other notable outlets, even get interested in a mid-20th century, rather abstract, bordering on archaic debate between an English economist and John Maynard Keynes and the Austrian, sitting at the foot of Mises, F.A. Hayek. I mean, how do you even broach that subject, even to begin with?
Well, I was, like I think everybody else, trying to come to terms with what was happening in 2008 with the global financial crisis and the crack up of the mortgage market. And because I was old enough to now at that time be married and have a mortgage and be sort of aware of the role of interest rates, at least in terms of my mortgage and why and how they impact the decision making in that context, I just started to go slowly down a rabbit hole of trying to understand what was going on. I've always been fairly politically minded, but I really put that on the back burner when I got out of college and went to work at MTV. Not the least of which because I was, pretty conservative at the time, and that was not exactly the common worldview among my peers. And so I, in the name of my priorities, I thought, well, I'm just going to keep my politics to myself and focus on the creativity and focus on the work and let those conversations happen in private. And which is, it's fine. I'm not somebody that holds any grudges or this us versus them stuff that people get wrapped up in. I'm just not into that. I think that's a waste of time and energy. And I feel like it's the kind of thing that people do that don't have a real life. They don't have real friends or real family that they care enough about, or they have them, but they don't care enough about them. So they wrap their identities up in their politics. So I just set that stuff aside for the most part. And, but it came roaring back with the financial crisis and with the extraordinary news and policies and public debates that were taking place. And so along the way, really thanks to Ron Paul, who single-handedly, I think, introduced a lot of people to these issues surrounding monetary theory and the Fed and the role of the Fed in the business cycle. And he's just drawing on, the classical and Austrian economists like Hayek and Mises and
I
and that,
can't, I really can't get over as I look back at his two presidential runs, what an anomaly he was. I think I took it for granted at the time when he went on the Tonight Show and turned to the audience of, umpteen millions of people and started talking about, well, I follow Austrian economics and Mises. I mean, I don't expect to hear anything like that ever again. So he definitely introduced a whole generation.
Yeah, he's pretty unique in time and space for sure. And so I reached out to my favorite podcasting economist, Russ Roberts, because I just loved his podcast, Econ Talk, and I loved his approach to people and to subjects, and said I want to do a collaboration. It turned out I was more passionate about the actual Austrian business cycle theory than Russ. Russ is a big believer and a big fan of Hayek, but is in a way super Austrian because he's very skeptical of any macro theory, even the Austrian business cycle theory.
Right.
I think Austrian devotees can sometimes get a little too mechanical in how they think about, like, oh, well, interest rates went down, so everything's a bubble now. It's like, well, that's not necessarily true because there's supply and demand, and interest rates are a price, and you can't really reason just based on the price. Like, if gas prices go up, is it because supply went down or demand went up? You don't know which one it is or in what proportions. I've learned a lot from Russ, and we began that process of trying to come up with something to do creatively together, and the result of that was Fear the Boom and Bust. And when that took off, I thought, well, it was released in 2010, and I sort of thought that my interest would start to wane in this stuff as the recession sort of began to recede, and
it was sort of memory hold, wasn't it?
The president, and the memory and the presidential election waned, but now we're in like the era where it's always presidential election politics 24/7. So that's not the way it used to be. It's like I remember 2001, people were going nuts about Bush v. Gore 2000, and then it kind of stopped being all about the president all the time. I mean, so it's a really weird time we live in now, where everything's always and this insane news cycle about politics, national politics all the time. But I just never lost the bug. I got the disease, the economics disease, and there is no cure, I guess.
And you sort of go down a deep rabbit hole. So Keynes versus Hayek, in case listeners don't already know, is I guess for lack of a better phrase, it's a rap video. It's so much more than that. But John and company, and by the way, Russ Roberts' Econ Talk is easily one of my favorite podcasts, and he can go from straight economics, what is econometrics or high theory, into what I think is one of his best interviews, which was with Christopher Hitchens over his work on Orwell. So Roberts is rangy. He's an incredible podcaster. If you haven't already listened, just get out there and listen. You'll be better for it. But you produce a rap video, and the danger is always, kind of like those 70s Christian folk videos, right? They with the toothy Protestant, youth group leader trying to be cool and hip, that they're dated, they're stale. And this one has so much production value to it, and it's got this swagger and these inside jokes, and it's hooky. It's so good. And I know you've been told this a million times, but it really is kind of an easy way to introduce somebody to a debate that perhaps they didn't know even occurred. And so you you put together Hayek versus Keynes. And what was the reaction like, say, outside of academia or outside of people who might have gravitated toward the subject anyway? Like, what did you hear?
It's funny. I remember when we released the video on January 28th, I think it was 2010. And we were very fortunate because Russ had a great relationship with the folks that did the Planet Money podcast on NPR.
Oh,
and
right.
So they actually did a story about the video, and that story actually ran, a shorter version of the story actually ran on All Things Considered on the radio, which has like 12 million listeners in the New York City area, and I guess around the country because of digital. And I was on set in Los Angeles directing a shoot for a new show on Spike. And it took all my willpower to not just sit there refreshing my phone because I was watching the views on this video. Because there was no spend behind it. It wasn't like we paid to buy views or anything, which is, which is necessary now because there's just so many, there's trillions of videos out there. It just was like, at the end of the first day, I think we had like 150 or 250,000 views.
Wow.
And it just took off like this rocket. And then we ended up getting invited to, I have screenshots of this. In that first like 24, 48 hours, this video was on the front, on the cover, like the homepage above the fold on CNN and like Bloomberg. And
wow.
The New York Times Economics blog, and it was like incredible, and CNBC, and so it was just a completely crazy, like nothing I had done in television had achieved that kind of organic reach, with one exception, which is I did a shot-for-shot recreation of the original Back to the Future theatrical teaser trailer, and that went crazy viral and got like 5 million views in the first 48 hours. And unfortunately, it probably have like 200,000 views, 200 million views now, except that Viacom was in a spat with Google and YouTube, and they ended up pulling it, which is a real bummer. You can still find there's reposts that have like 10 million views of this thing, but
I'm sure it was great. I'm sure it was wonderful, but frankly, even if you got 100 million views for the Back to the Future thing, as someone, listening to you talk, I'd be like, well, duh. I mean, like that I could see happening. But Keynes versus Hayek? No way, dude. No way would I see that breaking through the matrix.
Yeah, I think it was just, it was a concern that was in the zeitgeist. It was like, what are we supposed to do in the aftermath of this collapse? And, the Obama administration went all in on Keynesianism. And, this was all resurgent because Keynesianism was basically discredited in the 70s. There's always natural Keynesianism in government because politicians always want to spend money. So there's always like this excuse to deficit spend and claim it's going to stimulate the economy. But that's just crooked. That's just a self-interested scam. The actual theoretical arguments basically got decimated during the 1970s, where unemployment was going up at the same time as inflation, which the Keynesian economists at the time claimed was impossible because of quote unquote slack in the economy.
The stagflation idea.
Yeah, so stagflation really blew away the idea of the Phillips curve, that there's a trade-off between employment and inflation, is nonsense. But because there obviously isn't. But there you have it. I mean, there's deflation in Japan with 3% unemployment. Like, give me a break. Who still believes this nonsense?
But what's great about the Keynes versus Hayek video, and I think one of the many reasons as to why it did so well, which is I would like to lead into kind of your newer project now and how you're approaching it. But I could not tell, and you spoke earlier in the podcast here of kind of your tone and how you look at the world and how you approach things, and the us versus them is so played out, even though I love it and I'm a tribalist and cheerleader for my side and everything. But I do appreciate that tone, because when I delivered the video, even though people knew it was from me, and I would repost it and they go, oh, here's another idiot posting his silliness again. When they watched it, they were like, I cannot tell from which side this Popola guy or Emergent Order or whomever, I cannot tell who the makers were rooting for. And you were so generous and you were so charitable in the way that you presented the Keynes argument. We call it now, I guess, steel manning as opposed to straw manning. So you really did put forward, Keynes's best ideas. I mean, as much as you could in a a few minute rap video. But I was a little worried when, again, I found it. I was like, okay, so they're just going to take apart Keynes, and this is going to be a worthless exercise. But I think you really did frame it as an important debate. And as I found out later, you have a perspective, but it was important for you, I guess, to make sure that all sides are heard, right?
It's funny. If you actually look at, like most of us, if you look at some of my Facebook posts, you wouldn't feel like I was the most even-handed, fair broker all the time, because I think social media brings out the tribalist in all of us. And it certainly is fun to, gin up that energy, like that fire in your belly for the things you believe in. And believe me, I have a lot of fire in my belly for stuff. But I think that when it comes to, first, I think the creative process is it takes so much more effort than blathering on social media. And so if you're going to put that much time and effort in, first of all, it's so much better to create something that's going to have some longevity and have some be able to be scrutinized. So that's one aspect of it, is I just want to make something that's more durable than like a throwaway sort of piece of propaganda.
Just to
the second thing is
base, right?
Yeah, it's like, there's all these fly-by-night new media companies that churn out crap 24 hours a day until their equity Ponzi scheme collapses. And that's just not the way I like to do things creatively. I like to put a lot more of intention into my work. And so that tends to moderate things, if you will, because you spend more time on the writing. I do just think in general as an ethic that if you don't understand the other point of view, you can't even claim to understand your own. I'm paraphrasing John Stuart Mill.
Yeah.
It's a lot more work to understand Keynes when you think Hayek is right and you think capitalism and free enterprise and laissez-faire is the way to go, both ethically and just consequentialistically, just in terms of outcomes. But I think that makes it more fun. I intellectually, it's way more fun to actually be able to understand the other side. It makes you a much better debater because you understand their perspective, and you're not gonna get hit with some unanticipated question that you never really grappled with. So the other thing I think is, and I did think about this from the outset, is I wanted everyone to be able to share this, and I wanted it to have the potential to get used in schools. And a one-sided piece of propaganda is not going to get used in schools. And so from my perspective, Hayek was so underrepresented relative to his contributions. I mean, he's one of the single greatest thinkers of the past 150 years. And most people that study economics don't hear about him. I mean, never mind whatever cockamamie economics degree people like AOC got at her school, which is might as well have been a pamphlet. You can go to MIT and not necessarily learn Hayek.
Right. No,
it's
you're
crazy.
Right.
The guy won a Nobel Prize. I mean, he's like one of the most influential thinkers of the 20th century. So to me, just pulling his chair up to the table and giving him an equal voice was the goal. And that's what we set out to do, and that's how we approached it.
Brilliant. It was brilliant. And again, people that I showed the video to were unable to ferret out exactly what the angle of the video was. So it was done brilliantly. So now you're 10 years out, millions of views, and we're in a new era where socialism is coming back with a vengeance, at least rhetorically. How much it is real socialism or not, everybody debates. But it certainly is in the zeitgeist again. The younger folks approaching presidential elections and midterm elections are all about democratic socialism. So it's back up again. And so now you're on to a new project where, again, you're taking rather obscure 20th, or actually, I guess Marx is not a 20th century thinker, but you're taking rather relatively obscure thinkers in terms of what they covered, and you're going to try to represent that debate. Can you go into a little bit about your Mises versus Marx idea?
Sure. So I've teamed up with, you mentioned Jeffrey Tucker. So I've teamed up with Ed Stringham and Jeffrey Tucker at the American Institute for Economic Research, to bring this debate to life. This was the third video in my mind going back 8 years. I wanted to do Mises versus Marx almost as soon as Fight of the Century was done. It's interesting that at the time it seemed like maybe more of a stretch. Like, is talking about socialism really something that is on the zeitgeist? Yeah, there was Occupy Wall Street and a sort of fringe of people who were calling for socialism and communism and wearing Che Guevara shirts and thinking
but
that
they weren't naming it.
Yeah, they weren't. There wasn't a mainstreaming of that. You had radical fringe on the left who were saying, yeah, socialism for sure. Let's do that. Let's go. Let's try that because it's never been tried for real or whatever. And but today, oh my gosh, I mean, who would have imagined 30 years after the fall of the Berlin Wall? It's like, the Marx has this great line: history repeats itself first as tragedy, then as farce. And we're definitely in the farce phase right now. We do have all the lyrics are fully written. We're in the music production process. We're working with two new collaborators, Trip and Tyler, who are these hilarious and fantastic YouTubers who've done some amazing videos to play Mises and Marx. I'm writing it with my head writer here at Emergent Order, Marshall Walker Lee, and so we're going to be shooting in about a month. We're going to be shooting late July. We've got an Indiegogo campaign going right now to help with the post-production process, and so that's really exciting because we've actually exceeded our funding goal there. But there's a lot of opportunities to make use of more resources. So anybody who's interested in this socialism versus capitalism debate getting a fair shake, and a strongly worded shake from both sides, please check it out.
For sure.
And I'm applying, it's the same recipe. It's very equal. It's very even-handed. I will say that some people have asked, well, how can you be even-handed when, Keynesianism and this macroeconomics stuff has a lot of subtlety and complexity where you can argue that, things would have been worse without the stimulus, and there's not really knockdown, surefire falsifications for it, really, because of the macroeconomics.
Keynes at least believed
business.
in private property, right? I mean, he at least had some sort of market sensibilities.
Yeah, when Keynes responded to the Road to Serfdom, he wrote a letter to Hayek saying that he, largely agreed with the book, but disagreed where the line should be drawn as far as the role for planning. And he thought there was a bigger role for state planning than Hayek did, but that there was a line, and it was about debating where that line is. So, whereas Marx, he is trying to reimagine the entire sort of social construct from the ground up. And so what we're trying to do, and you can say, well, I mean, come on, like there's never been a successful socialism. The closest you could argue that has occurred is the kibbutzim in Israel.
Yes.
And most of them couldn't survive the process. They mostly abandoned communal property in order to survive, because it turns out when everybody owns stuff, nobody does. And you turn everything into a tragedy of the commons where people free ride and take more than they should. And, it's like everybody becomes like poachers of elephants in Africa. Nobody owns the elephants. And so anybody can take them and they get depleted. And I think that's a fair argument. I mean, I personally obviously agree with that argument.
Sure.
I think socialism is a idea whose time has long since passed. But just because I believe that doesn't mean the rest of the world agrees. And Marx is arguably the most influential thinker of the past 250 years.
I think
So
that's
rather
not a
than
small
just
point
backing him
at all.
around,
Yeah.
you know, it's like we have to contend with his success and idea, his intellectual and spiritual success, if you will, because I think in some sense it's he almost enters the world of metaphysics with the way he concerns
sure.
himself with whether people are manly and are returned to the physicality of making things and being alienated from the things that we make. And there's these almost metaphysical, sociological things that when you read him, and I have not exhaustively read Marx, and he's a tough read, just like Hayek and Mises are. But you do get, he's rousing and he's potent. And so we've tried to capture that as best we can with the lyric. And I'd like to think that somebody who is sympathetic to Marx would look at this and say, well, hey, they steel-manned him. They didn't just set him up to get knocked down, you know?
And will this, I don't want you to reveal too much if you don't want to, but will this be another hip-hop flavor?
Oh, yes. No, there's something so great about hip hop and rap music as a format for this kind of dialogue or dialectic, if you will, because the lyrics are dense. Battling is part of the genre, and that kind of back and forth between voices is mostly, you find that in. It's rare to find that in other musical forms. And I just think music in general is such a powerful, emotional art form that, you know, my favorite stuff, my favorite work has strong music components to it. So, you know, this is very, very much true to form to the original Keynes versus Hayek rap videos. It's, we're just trying to, again, like we always do, take it to the next level in every way we possibly can, from production value to music to everything about it. We're trying to one up ourselves.
And in a way, this is kind of a prequel, isn't it? Just thinking about it now, because if people were, which they definitely were, more familiar with Hayek than they ever would be of Mises, it's actually Hayek who sort of, inherits the Misesian tradition, goes off in his certainly his own direction. But some people even said that Hayek's Nobel Prize was sort of a nod to Mises, who died a few years earlier without that kind of recognition. Who was Ludwig von Mises, and why do you set him against Karl Marx?
I think that it's really important to understand that Mises had some strong disadvantages in terms of his opportunities to really be celebrated in the public eye. He was writing, at a time as the Nazis were taking power, and was really on the run from the Nazis, and he didn't enter academia when he came to America with the same opportunities that Hayek did. And so I think he is an unsung hero of the liberal tradition in a lot of respects. There's obviously organizations like the Mises Institute, which are dedicated to him. I don't think outside of that, he's gotten enough recognition. And the fact of the matter is that Mises wrote a critique of socialism and of socialist central planning in the 1920s, socialist calculation and economic calculation in the socialist commonwealth,
right,
which is, in my opinion, a everlasting and devastating critique of the concept of central planning and the elimination of private property. He was so sharp, and his understanding of the challenge of making decisions in a complex world filled with millions of resources and millions of uses of time, talent, and treasure, and the necessary need for a coordinating calculation device, a metric of decision making, and that metric of decision making in a market economy is prices. And the basic argument from Mises is, look, without private property, you can't have buyers and sellers bidding on the basis of supply and demand. So so you can't have prices that have any meaning, because prices in the marketplace are a kind of information signal about whether something is in demand or not, whether something is scarce or not, relatively speaking. And so this change of prices that we observe generates information not just about not just about the cost, but about the opportunity. And he basically lays out that you can't collectivize the means of production without eliminating the single mechanism for trying to decide which means of production to use when, and whether to create new means of production. There's a kind of static world snapshot at the heart of all socialist sort of theorizing, which is we already have these quote unquote means of production, and the only debate is who is in control of them, and is it these evil bourgeois capitalists, or is it quote the people? And what Mises lays out is a multi-layered critique of that, but at the heart of it is this challenge that without private property and a market in capital goods, in all goods, but especially in the capital goods, in the things that we use to make stuff, you won't have any ability to calculate. And so you'll end up with this sort of joke of the Soviet model where these sort of value destroying state owned firms where, there's only one car and it doesn't work. And why, and the old saying was, they pretend to pay us and we pretend to work. That was an old saying, and
they often relied on the black market, which ironically the sort of the agorist model. So to be able to get prices, they would sort of have to sort of look to the black markets and look to actual functioning markets, right?
Yeah, there was Soviet central planners would import the Sears Roebuck catalog to try to get a sense of what things should cost. So for a global revolutionary movement that is supposed to ultimately achieve total and totalitarian success, that's kind of a problem. We can make it work. We just need those lovely people at Sears Roebuck to tell us what everything should cost. As if that even was relevant to the cost structures of timber and steel and labor and everything in Russia. But that's how ignorant you are as an individual when it comes to the complexity of an economy with trillions of decisions being made and being mediated by the market and by prices. And this is as devastating a critique today of things like the Green New Deal or the central planning of credit through things like the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. Every one of these sort of top-down command and control schemes falls prey to Mises's original critique about the impossibility, he called it, that socialist calculation is impossible, and that it can only even appear to function essentially by parasitically relying on private markets in adjacent things. So you'll hear people say, well, what do you mean socialism is impossible? The post office works. In fact, let's turn it into a bank. It's like, well, the post office doesn't have to worry about what the cost of lumber is to build a new post office. There's a market in lumber for that.
Right.
So, or how much it's going to cost to buy that next new vehicle. It's all, that's what the market's for. It's a government provided service. So this sort of expansion of the government firefighting is socialism. No, it's not. It's just the fact that there's a police force does not mean socialism works. That argument suggests that there's only two systems, socialism and anarchy, that there's no middle ground where you can have a government and private property and government provided services. It's like a crazy appropriation of something to say that's a common, Capitalism, a Love Story by Michael Moore,
Exactly.
plays the Soviet anthem and shows the firefighters and the police and public schools, which are kind of a disaster unless you're rich, and says, look, we already have socialism. It's like, well, no, we don't. Like, what are you talking about?
Yeah. And, to be fair, which I'd rather not, but to be fair, Mises was known for his stridency. And anybody who deviated a little bit, he was by no means an anarchist, but which I would love to claim him as. But he would definitely call you a socialist if you hinted towards. He even wrote a book, or there was one assembled called The Anti-Capitalist Mentality. He was kind of known as a strident guy. So if you moved away from it, and I think some of that's been misinterpreted down the line, so that especially guys on my side go, and I'm just as guilty of this. If we see even a little deviation from that, we call it socialism. So, but in any case,
yeah, the political right in general has done the debate a disservice by calling everything socialism.
Mm-hmm.
It's a problem I'm guilty of as much as anybody else. But when you really stop to think about it, it's not too dissimilar from what we have now, where everybody to the quote unquote right of Bernie Sanders is a white supremacist.
Right.
Well, you realize now you're creating cover for actual white supremacists when you paint such a broad brush.
Great.
And I think, unfortunately, the John Birch Society and radical folks, and I'm myself am a radical, and I'm guilty of this too. When you call when Social Security is socialism, it's like, well, it's not collectivized property and central planning and the means of production. It's a welfare program, and it's a Ponzi scheme, and that's fine. Like, we can call it a Ponzi scheme because it is, but it's not socialism. Again, that's the opposite of what the Marxists do, and to say that we reduce the world to either communism or anarchy. And I just think that's where are these anarchist utopias, and where are these communist utopias? Like, at the far ends of the spectrum, I think heaven is surely an anarchy. There's no need for government in heaven. So I think there's nothing wrong philosophically with saying government is force and therefore it has no legitimate moral authority. I think that's a totally legitimate argument, but it is a moral argument. It's not an empirical one. I'm not discounting that. I'm just saying it's you got to kind of understand what category you're arguing in, because when you get down to, well, how do the institutions of private property tend to actually work? We create little forms of government at some level. I mean, I actually live in a small town inside of Austin. The residents are only like 800 people. What's the difference between the governance of an 800-person town and an 800-person company and their policies? It's not that hard to move out of the town. It's not that hard to quit the company.
Mm-hmm.
There's distinctions there at that level where the freedom to exit and the cost of exit is comparable. They're pretty comparable. Like, okay, this downtown says I'm not allowed to cut down a tree over 28 inches in diameter. I think that's an infringement on my freedom, but I don't have to live there if I don't want to.
Right.
My company has a dress code. I don't like it. Well, I don't have to work there if I don't want to. As the units of governance get bigger, and as the cost of escape gets higher, I think we really get into some trouble. But like, to your point, Mises is a hardcore guy, and that makes him the perfect combatant with Marx, who was absolutely a polemicist in every sense.
Yeah, I cannot wait to see what you guys come up with. I've been speaking with the great John Popola, who is an educator and entertainer. He's also an artist, and everything he touches, I've seen some of his political work for foundations and so on. He's just an incredible, incredible voice. Someone who's sober, he's got his bags packed, he's ready to make the argument. Emergent Order and his work needs your support, so get out to Indiegogo. We'll link to that in the show notes. So lastly here, how can listeners follow your work and find you?
Well, I appreciate all the kind words, and thanks for having me on. Definitely subscribe to our YouTube channel, which is youtube.com/Emergent Order. This was formerly the Econ Stories channel, and we've just consolidated all of our efforts under the Emergent Order banner. If you're interested in this debate about socialism versus capitalism, another piece of work that I've spent the past 3 years doing is a feature film starring Arthur Brooks called The Pursuit, which is available now on iTunes. And so you can get that on iTunes, and it's going to be available in Netflix in August. And of course, check us out on social media. You can find us on Facebook and all the rest. I'm not a big Twitter user. I think Twitter is basically a cesspool of despair. So, but connect with me on Facebook. I'll be happy to respond in kind.